How can a good God allow certain mental illnesses in creation? That is the three sunburst question we will be examining today, so stick around. Hello, my name is Father Ambrose Little, and I teach philosophy at the Dominican House of Studies. Welcome to Aquinas 101, Big Questions, Little Answers, the series where I do my best to answer your big questions about philosophy, theology, and more. One of our viewers asked an interesting question about psychological illness that also generated a related comment that I think would be good to answer. The original question is the following. I have a question regarding certain mental illnesses. How do psychopathy, sociopathy, narcissist personality disorder, and other mental illnesses fit into creation? Are they just errors that exist on God's creation? These individuals certainly by nature do not feel compassion or love for other human beings, and only act for the sake of self-satisfaction. Or is there any other explanation available? So that's the question. In some ways, this question is just another example of the problem of evil, which we have addressed in other Aquinas 101 videos. But there are some features of this question that make the viewer think that these particular mental disorders are a special problem. There are a couple of key assumptions that motivate our viewers' worry. The first is that the psychological illnesses named are supposed to be a result of an inability to have compassion for others. There are certainly important details missing from this assessment of these disorders, but that lack of ability to have compassion is key to our viewers' worries. The second assumption is that these disorders are built into the person's nature in some way. This is even more problematic if there is no physical cause of the disorder, because if it were part of the immaterial intellect, then there is no reason to think that the individual can change. It is this last assumption that I think makes it look like these psychological illnesses are a special case of the problem of evil. In response to this worry, it is important to note that psychological illnesses are not a special case of the problem of evil. With the common answers to the problem of evil, we can accept that there are certain physical and even moral evils that God permits for the sake of a greater good. Some of the physical evils are even present from birth. For instance, we know that some people are born with clubbed feet or missing body parts, and some are genetically prone to certain types of disease. I think that there is also good evidence that psychological disorders are similar, in that a significant source of these disorders has a bodily component, even if that is only a contributing factor. So if we can accept that other physical evils are compatible with God's goodness, then psychological illnesses are not a special case of the problem of evil, since they appear to have some basis in neurophysiological problems. In response to the original question, another viewer responded by saying that this, quote, seems to give a very strong case for the hypothesis that the mind is contingent upon the physical. People's brain structure can change their entire personality, erase their memories, etc. If the mind or spirit is something immaterial, a ghost in the machine, how would you assess that? This is a good question and worthy of an answer. The first response we can give is that Thomists do not believe that the soul or spirit is a ghost in the machine. And we have discussed this in other Aquinas 101 videos, so I won't go into the details here. The key for understanding the Thomistic position is to understand that there are parts of what we often call mind that are physical and other parts that are immaterial. For example, Aristotle and St. Thomas are committed to the idea that the imagination and memory are physical, and that there are physical parts of the body where those activities are taking place. That is why, for instance, animals, like dogs, can have dreams and memories. But St. Thomas, and I think this is also true for Aristotle, holds that there are parts of the mind that are immaterial, and that is what he calls the intellect. So what we today tend to call the mind is really a set of powers associated with the soul, some of which have a basis in matter and others which are immaterial. What this means is that a Thomist can talk about how physical maladies can cause mental illnesses, insofar as they affect mental activity associated with sensation, memory, and imagination. This does not, however, take away from the thesis that we have an immortal soul, since there is a part of the mind that is immaterial and can survive the death of the body. Now let us turn back to the original question about psychological illnesses where people seem to have a fundamental lack of compassion or love. Even if there is a physiological explanation for these disorders, we might wonder, is there hope for someone who suffers from them? Yes. Although we tend to associate love with a certain affection for another or a compassion, St. Thomas actually gives us a much more boring definition of love. He tells us that love is, quote, willing the good of another, end quote. Even if someone cannot feel compassion for another, it is possible to will the good for someone else, even without that feeling. And if that is so, then even psychopaths and narcissists can learn to love. It is a matter of building the habits and the virtue of willing the good for another, even if one does not feel it. What is more, there are some treatments that appear to be somewhat effective in helping those suffering from psychopathology to learn how to live in society through a process of repeated positive reinforcement. This is not unlike how St. Thomas and other virtue ethicists talk about virtue development. So is there hope for those with these psychological illnesses? Of course. In God, there is always hope, and we know that if we trust in Him, our hopes will not be in vain. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Big Questions, Little Answers. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, may God bless you and keep you in His grace. I hope that answers all your questions, but if not, please let us know by submitting your big questions using #AskAFriar in the YouTube comments and on social media. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your friends, because it matters what you think.